There has been much concern about public protests over the past 20 years. The Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection and the Wits School of Governance has put together research detailing some of the challenges. Joining us to take us through some of the findings is Heidi Brooks, who edited the research study titled Protest in South Africa, Rejection, Reassertion, Reclamation, a publication of the Wits School of Governance. Heidi, thank you for making time for us this afternoon. So according to this research, why are we seeing an escalation of mass protests in the country over the last 20 years?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. Yeah, so the book really tries to kind of get to the bottom of some of the underpinnings that we see in post-94 protest. And it speaks to the issue of not only an increasing frequency of protest, but a kind of increasing intensity of protest that we see in South Africa. And it really looks at a variety of protests, the different kind of protest actors that we see, you know, from community level protests that are often issues around governance, poor governance, service delivery, to the kind of violence, public violence that went beyond protest that we saw in July of 2021. So it speaks to not only a sort of increasing frequency, but what one of the authors of the book, Professor Susan Boyson, refers to as a densification of protests, of protest activity, and a increasing variety in the range of protests. Whether sometimes they're pushing the state to do their job, sometimes protests are asking for improved governance and more democracy, and in other cases they're suggesting a kind of a rejection of democratic values themselves.
Mm-hmm. How much of this escalation has to do with unresponsive leaders, where communities are forced to resort to protest because they simply feel unheard by those in power?
Very much so, and across the kind of range of cases that are studied in the book, a lot of common underpinnings, and that's really what the book is trying to do and demonstrates, is that there's a variety of protests for a variety of reasons. The short-term triggers or the immediate drivers may differ, but underpinning many of them is this kind of sense of frustration, of poor governance, of very slow, delayed or absence of delivery, and of the kind of persistence of socioeconomic inequalities and issues of poverty that we continue to see in South Africa. So much of that, of the protests that we see, is underpinned by that kind of absence of delivery, and issues of poor governance, and really a kind of an absence of many of the anticipated substantive democratic outcomes that we expected to see of the post-94 project.
Yeah. You spoke not only about the increasing frequency of these protests, but the intensity as well of the protests. And the problem with feeling unheard or unconsidered is that, you know, protests then get violent because protesters feel that's the only way to get the attention of the authorities.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and we have seen this kind of escalation of violent protest. There's a chapter in the book that looks at the kind of policing of protest, and in some cases we've seen protests tend to escalate into violent forms when the police are present. But there's certainly, I think, more research to be done around the interconnection between protest activity and the escalation of violence and the extent to which that protest is violent. But we have seen this sort of intensification of protest, whether it's peaceful or violent or disruptive. You know, sometimes protest is not violent per se, but it's disruptive. It disrupts roads and routes and access and that kind of thing. And we've certainly seen that kind of rising intensity.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this concept of transactional activism, where state actors provide leaders of protest groups with incentives. How rife is that?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book by Setuleko Matebesi at the University of the Free State, and he's particularly looked at this idea of transactional activism, where there are kind of incentives offered to protest leaders once they start engaging with the state or private actors. And he selects a number of cases and a variety of types of protest where that kind of thing has happened. And in fact, it then undermines the kind of collective and community objectives of that protest. So it forces us to look not just at the protest action, but the way the kind of agendas of protest communities can be compromised by this kind of transactionalism, almost a form of clientelism, I suppose, between the protest leader and authorities, be them public or private.
Yeah. So the thing, Heidi, that we've also seen is this mushrooming of organizations like Operation Dudula, for instance, where you see the promotion of active citizenship, but it's underpinned by a particular ideology which arguably leads to the weaponization of grassroots.
Yeah, indeed. And again, there's a particular chapter in the book by Luke Simwell, Terry Maggott and Trevor Ngwane at the University of Johannesburg that researches very specifically the case of Operation Dudula. And it's a very good example of how protest is not only used for the purposes of social justice. It's not only progressive forces that use protests to demand greater democracy or improved governance. It's often used as a weapon by those who are seeking to exclude certain communities, in the Dudula case, to exclude migrants to South Africa and to target in particular foreign nationals. And so it's a very good example of how protest has become a xenophobic tool as well, and an agenda of what we might call Afrophobia, where particularly migrants from other parts of the continent are targeted in protest activity.
So how can we then prevent this weaponization of grassroots democracy and thereby prevent the killing of more individuals? I mean, we've seen people like Elvis Nyati, falling victim to this.
Yeah. And the particular point that the authors of that chapter are making, and this comes out strongly in the book as a whole, is really the kind of agendas behind protests need to be pushing our own democratic values in South Africa, and people need to kind of understand the root causes of the protests they face, the challenges they face, the material circumstances and challenges that they face, and instead of understanding those as caused by migration to South Africa and competition over resources, it's actually people's deeper socioeconomic circumstances and contexts of continued material deprivation for many South Africans. And that is really at the cause of people's material circumstances that mean that they engage in protest, but often there's a kind of scapegoat of things like foreign nationals. So, protest can certainly be an action that is very much a grassroots action, which that particular chapter highlights. And it's an action that is calling for improved governance and greater democracy, and essentially a much improved form of citizenship. Many South Africans continue to feel socially, politically, economically excluded in their day-to-day, and that really needs to be tackled if we're to try and reduce protest. Otherwise, I think as part of this research highlights, protest can be used and weaponized against others who are vulnerable, such as migrants in South Africa.
Yeah. Heidi Brooks, thank you so much for coming through and enlightening us on this research that you've conducted, helping us understand more about the nature of these protests and how weaponized they can be.